Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Dr. Sayers Teaches Something. An episode I'm filming on a very auspicious date, the first day of the 245th year of American independence, or the 4th day of July in the year of our Lord 2020. And today, as you may guess, we'll be talking about the American Declaration of Independence, a document most famous for its second sentence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is, to be sure, a noble sentiment, and in some ways perhaps the most important part of a very important document. But at the time, the Declaration of Independence was not simply a statement of beliefs. It was in many ways a legal document explaining to a candid world why the United States was legally justified in declaring independence from Great Britain. It was also in some ways a public relations statement to convince people around the world that America had a right to declare independence, not just in a legal, but perhaps in a moral sense as well. Likewise, to convince people in Britain sympathetic to the American cause that the Declaration of Independence was necessary, indeed was forced upon the American people. Even the American people themselves perhaps needed to be convinced of this. John Adams, many years later, as admittedly a bitter old man, stated his belief that 1/3 of Americans were opposed to independence, 1/3 were indifferent, and only 1/3 were true blue. And so the Declaration of Independence in many ways was meant to convince Americans that independence was necessary. A sentiment that many had come to accept in that year of 1776, following the publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, and following by the date of the Declaration over a year of open fighting in and around Boston and elsewhere. But it was still a difficult decision to make, and one the Declaration of Independence sought to justify. Indeed, going out of its way to say this was a drastic step, one that people rarely undertook, one not entered into lightly, and again, one forced on the colonies. Pointing out in several cases, essentially, this is not something we wanted to do. We tried to work things out. This was forced upon us. And so, while the second sentence of the Declaration of Independence in particular, and the second paragraph in general, are the most famous, as they are the most uplifting, in many ways the most interesting, discussing the notion of contract theory, that government is based on the consent of the governed. Once you move past the second paragraph, you get by far the longest section of the Declaration of Independence, and one that doesn't thrill people very much today, but which is a long list of complaints against the King of Great Britain, against George III, to prove to the world that he was acting as a tyrant and was no longer fit to govern a free people. Indeed, the English people, including the English colonists in America, viewed themselves as the freest people on earth. At least considering Europe as Earth, everything else being sort of separate and extra. And in many ways this was true. About 2% of the British population could vote, which may not sound like much today, was much more than, say, in France, where one man could vote, that being Louis XVI. The English had a long-standing tradition of rights, in traditions dating back to time immemorial, which is sometime before the 1100s. The Magna Carta of the early 1200s, the English Bill of Rights of 1689, set down on paper many specific rights of Englishmen. And the English colonists in America were proud, at least into the 1770s, to be English subjects and to have those rights, until it seemed like those rights were being ignored or actively violated by the British government. So the Declaration of Independence set out to prove that. And what made the Declaration different from previous complaints was that it directly targeted the king, blaming him for all these acts of tyranny. Previously, critics of the British government had criticized the king's advisors, or perhaps had picked out particular members of parliament or various royal officials. The king himself, though, they had not criticized, that being dangerously close to treason. But to single out the king made this very clearly an act of breaking away from Britain. They also made a point of saying that they had repeatedly reached out, not just to the king and been rejected, but to Parliament and been rejected, and to the British people as a whole and been ignored. Covering, I suppose, all their bases, with a series of complaints dating back to 1763, even if that date was not given. That year, of course, being the end of the French and Indian War, which left Britain deep in debt and with a huge empire to govern, one which they attempted to constrict with the proclamation of 1763, keeping, they hoped, colonists in America from moving west to the Appalachian Mountains very quickly and provoking the Indians into future conflict. For most Americans, the war had been about gaining land west of the Appalachian Mountains. They felt betrayed by that proclamation and by the fact that it required the British government to station many British soldiers in America to police the proclamation line, whereas in the past there had not really been a standing British force in North America. Indeed, it was a long-standing British viewpoint that a standing army was a tool of tyrants to oppress the people, that a free people required a small, or ideally no, standing army, an army only to be raised during times of emergency. Furthermore, the British began trying to regulate the colonial economy. Part of this was through a Currency Act in 1764, trying to strictly limit, as much as possible, to stop the colonies printing their own paper money, which they tended to print in large quantities, creating inflation, which destabilized the local economy. It was also a real problem for British merchants and others who were owed money by colonists who wanted to pay things back in their ever-depreciating colonial paper money. The British government wanted, at least British creditors, paid in specie, gold and silver, except those were very rare in the colonies. Indeed, most circulating silver coins were Spanish reals, pieces of 8, also known as Spanish dollars, which indeed would be the basis of the actual U.S. silver dollar to some degree up until 1978. And even to this date, stocks are traded in eighths of dollars, as the Spanish dollar could be divided into 8 pieces. The Currency Act really tried to limit colonial economic freedom. And of course, most famously, there was taxation without representation. The British had a fairly long-standing tradition whereby Parliament had the power of the purse, and most importantly, the elected House of Commons controlled the creation of new taxes. Had been one of the big causes of the English Civil War, as King Charles I had tried to raise new taxes on his own, or squeeze additional revenue out of existing taxes without having to work with Parliament. This went back to an even older notion that property granted independence. That only if you controlled enough property to be economically independent were you truly free. Indeed, while the Declaration of Independence speaks of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it was really a modification of John Locke and other political philosophers' discussion of life, liberty, and property, being felt that property was what guaranteed independence, and that your life, liberty, and property were the things that could not be taken from you in a free society without due process of law. And so, as some of my libertarian friends will tell you, taxation is theft. And so, in a free society, the government can't just take your money. Rather, the taxes that we do pay in a free society are our gift to the government. Now, you may not, when you go to the store, choose to pay 9.5% precisely of the purchase price of your goods to the state of Tennessee in the form of sales tax. That may not be the gift you would freely choose to make at that moment. Except it sort of is, because as the tax rate has been set by your elected representative. And if you did not elect them, that's your own fault for not voting, because you chose not to vote, or perhaps you were foolish enough to be under 18 or something like that. Or, of course, in the old days, not owning enough property or being sufficiently male. Those being things I highly recommend. So, the British government had always imposed some taxes on the colonies, but these were fairly minor taxes, not especially expensive, and perhaps most importantly, not very strictly enforced. And they were taxes on trade, which certainly raised some money for the British government, but were mainly about policing the empire, regulating trade within the empire, especially to try to keep trade within the empire, to make it difficult to trade with the French, especially with the Spanish, with the Dutch, and with their colonies. The mercantilist economic theories of the day being that countries should try to keep all their trade within their own boundaries or within their own empires. After all, when the value of currency was based on gold and silver, if you purchased stuff from other countries, your gold and silver was flowing into their treasuries, reducing your own money supply. Most economists today are not big fans of mercantilism, but it does make a certain amount of sense from the point of view of people in, say, the 1600s. And so most colonists theoretically accepted that the British Parliament could pass taxes of that sort to regulate trade for the entire empire, especially because they had not directly taxed the property of their subjects in America. Such taxes directly taxing the people's property could only be passed by their own elected representatives. Indeed, every single colony, all the 13 colonies at least, did elect at least part of their own legislature, a General Assembly, a House of Burgesses, or something along those lines. A few colonies even elected their own governor, although most colonies had a governor appointed by the king, or in a few cases by a proprietor, the Penn family, the Lords Baltimore, whomever may have technically owned one colony or another. But in this change after the French and Indian War too, as the British government had to raise more money to pay off the enormous debt incurred in the war. A Sugar Act was passed in 1764, which actually lowered the existing taxes on sugar and molasses and related goods, but tried to enforce them more strictly, sending royal officials to America to enforce those taxes, and furthermore, giving those officials the power to ship people accused of violating the law all the way back to England, where they would be tried by an admiralty court, by officers of the Royal Navy, not by a jury of their peers. And trial by jury was a very ancient English right, established in tradition and in law. Indeed, when the American Bill of Rights was written about a decade after independence, ratified in 1791, of the 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights, 3 of them guarantee trial by jury. There's no other right that we apparently cared quite as much about in the late 1700s. So this was fairly offensive to a lot of Americans, and then things got worse. That was, at least theoretically, an acceptable tax, because it taxed trade to regulate the empire. But shortly afterwards, Parliament created the stamp tax, which directly taxed most printed goods, and some other goods as well. You had to buy a stamp to put on them, kind of like renewing your car license plate every year by buying a little sticker that goes in the corner. So this was seen as directly taxing people's property, again, and done by members of Parliament not elected by any of the colonists. It is true that some colonists had kind of lobbyists in London. Benjamin Franklin filled that role for Pennsylvania and Delaware, I believe another colony at certain points. He lived in London for many, many years, in fact. But these were unofficial roles. And there was a lot of resentment and resistance to the Stamp Act, to the point where royal officials were afraid to actually sell the stamps in America. And the Stamp Act was repealed, but Parliament passed a declaratory act declaring they had the right to create any taxes they wanted in America. And this would be a pattern. Parliament would pass an unpopular tax or other law. The colonists would react, including with violence and threats of violence, as many stamp agents were threatened with violence. And Parliament would back down, but then would respond with something else that provoked the colonists yet again. So it's hard to say. Perhaps if Parliament had stuck to its guns early on and simply forced through the Stamp Act, while the colonists were still fairly satisfied to be British, things would have gone differently. Alternately, if Britain had returned to their older attitude of salutary neglect, largely letting the colonies do their own thing, maybe things would have worked out. But that's not how it went. Because once the Stamp Act was gone, Parliament soon passed a new series of taxes. And here Parliament tried to play along. The Townshend duties, as they were known, were taxes on trade, taxing various imports to the colonies, on paint and lead and glass, and most famously tea, and a number of other things as well. But by now, taxes on trade were not as cool as they apparently had been a couple of decades before. Colonists are mad about taxation without representation, plus taxes are more offensive when they're actually collected, or when they try to collect them. And so there were protests against this, and eventually Parliament, for the most part, backed down, particularly following the violence of the Boston Massacre, in which 4 colonists were shot after an angry mob of them attacked British soldiers outside the Customs House in Boston. Although, in fact, Parliament had already decided to repeal the Townshend duties by the time the Boston Massacre took place, but communication was much slower in those days than it is today. And so no one on either side knew what was going on until much too late. Indeed, had people had email in those days rather than having to send things for weeks or months by ship, things might have worked out a lot differently. Many problems might have been sorted out, or alternately, might have come to a head much sooner. But Parliament did repeal the Townshend duties, all but the one on tea, again to prove a point. And for a long time this was kind of accepted, until at last the colonists decided they'd had enough of this as well. At least in New England, where of course the Boston Tea Party took place in December of 1774. The destruction of about 10,000 pounds worth of tea, which in those days was a lot of money, and of course the refusal to pay taxes on it, was a major crisis for the British and the colonies. And the British decided they'd simply put up with too much. And so Parliament passed a group of 4 acts that they called the Coercive Acts, which did a few things. They removed the royally appointed governor of Massachusetts and replaced him with a different one, this time a military governor, General Thomas Gage, who was actually somewhat sympathetic to the colonists, but also didn't want to put up with too much nonsense. The Massachusetts legislature was abolished. The British Army sent several thousand troops into Boston and could quarter them as they saw fit. Boston was supposed to build barracks for them, but when they refused to build as many as they needed to, some soldiers were quartered in private homes. Many soldiers, in their time off, also took side jobs, competing with and driving down the wages of the local labor market. And Perhaps worst of all, Boston Harbor itself was shut down, ending trade in one of America's largest cities. And this shocked people throughout the colonies, as it seemed like a huge attack on English liberties in America. And so, not long, in addition to these 4 Coercive Acts, Parliament also passed the Quebec Act, which extended the borders of Quebec, which they'd taken from France in 1763, all the way down to the Ohio River, which first of all overlapped the land claims of Virginia and New York and Connecticut and Massachusetts, essentially stripping all of them of pretty large sections of land, at least on paper. Furthermore, by extending Quebec's boundaries, they extended Quebec's government, which protected the Catholic Church, protected the French language, and which did not have an elected assembly of any kind. This was seen, of course, as an encroachment on land claims, but also an attempt to squash liberty, to prevent representative government from spreading into the West. So this really concerned a lot of people, and in Virginia, the House of Burgesses voted for a day of prayer and fasting in sympathy for the people of Massachusetts. Now today, you'll often hear people rather criticize folks who offer their thoughts and prayers following various crises or tragedies, suspecting perhaps that the thoughts are not very deep, perhaps even the prayer is not that sincere, and the thoughts and prayers may not be followed up by action. So, again, thoughts and prayers today are sometimes not taken too seriously, but things were different, I guess, in 1775, as the royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, responded by dissolving the House of Burgesses. But they simply went down the road, met in the Raleigh Tavern, and decided they would continue to resist these encroachments on their liberty. Other colonial governors began dissolving their legislatures as well. By mid-1775, I believe 6 colonial legislatures had been dissolved, but the people of those colonies, accustomed to electing legislatures, created what some called reconstituted assemblies, unofficial legislatures to continue to govern their colonies as best they could, or at least coordinate resistance to the British. And those colonies, and those who still struggled on under their legitimate governments, sent delegates to a Second Continental Congress. As fighting broke out at Lexington and Concord, later Bunker Hill and elsewhere, around Boston, and eventually elsewhere in New England. There's even an American invasion of Canada. And so the Second Continental Congress, meeting in 1775, organizing a Continental Army led by Virginian George Washington, chosen because of his military experience and to show Congress's appreciation for at least one major Southern colony contributing to the war effort, and according to John Adams, because George Washington was the tallest man in the room. Congress had to decide what else to do, and there were still attempts to make peace with Britain. There was most famously the Olive Branch Petition, as it was known, sent to Britain, to the king, personally requesting the king have a ceasefire until the differences could be worked out. But when the Olive Branch Petition finally arrived in London, the king, who knew what was in it, refused to even receive it officially or read it. Indeed, by the time it had finally arrived, he had declared the colonies outside his protection, and the king's protection of his people in return for their loyalty. It was a very long-standing traditional view of monarchy's role, again, both traditionally and under the newer ideas of contract theory, that we owe our loyalty to the government if the government takes care of us. And the king also had begun hiring foreign mercenaries, primarily from the various German-speaking states of Central Europe, particularly a couple different states known as Hesse. So these German mercenaries were generally known as Hessians, although there were some from elsewhere in Germany as well. And so it seemed to many colonists the king was bringing outsiders into what was supposed to be essentially a family matter. And also by declaring the colonists in rebellion and outside his protection, kind of turning his back on people who had always insisted they were loyal to him, even if they were unhappy with some of his officials. And again, in January of 1776, Thomas Paine published Common Sense, proposing it was not sensible for a continent to be ruled by an island, putting in plain language the sense that many people had come to feel they had to separate from Britain. There were many other issues as well. In Virginia, the royal governor, Lord Dunmore, after trying unsuccessfully to seize the militia's arsenal, supplies of gunpowder and weapons in Williamsburg, had eventually fled and tried to govern the colony from a ship off the coast, and furthermore had said that any slave who would rise up against his master and fight for the British would gain his freedom, something the British would later do for runaway slaves who made it to Florida when Florida was a Spanish territory, something they would do for American slaves during the War of 1812, many of whom ended up settling in Trinidad and Tobago after the War of 1812 ended. But this attempt to create, as many slave owners saw it, a slave uprising terrified many slave owners. And of course, slavery was legal in all 13 colonies, and while most common in the South, was found elsewhere, particularly in New York as well. Furthermore, beyond the Appalachian Mountains, British Indian agents encouraged the Indians to attack Americans settling illegally west of the Proclamation Line, including in what's now East Tennessee, where forts were built, battles were fought, and sieges withheld in the summer of 1776. And the British Navy continued their practice of impressment, of forcing British subjects to serve in the British Navy. And this did include, of course, British subjects from America, and there were many American crewed merchant ships out there on the high seas, which the Royal Navy could seize and force the sailors to serve in the British military, which meant that potentially they would have to kill fellow Americans should war break out. And all these and many other things were seen as simply the British government going too far. And of course there were economic issues of taxation. Likewise, many colonists, especially Virginians, were deeply in debt to merchants in London, and maybe hoped not to have to pay those debts off. For many merchants throughout America, Britain's attempts to limit trade with non-British trading partners was a real inconvenience for people who wanted to trade with whomever was most convenient, particularly the French and Spanish and Dutch and Danish colonies in the Caribbean, and indeed countries around the world. There's also been some people who speculated that a fairly recent British court case, which had effectively freed an American slave in Britain, made many Southern slave owners, or American slave owners in general, feel threatened by British policies. Although the British court made it very clear this decision did not apply in any of its colonies, it essentially upheld the argument of one of the attorneys in the case that the air of England is too free for a slave to breathe, that a slave brought to England could escape and could not be forced to return to his owner. And while this, again, very clearly did not apply to the colonies yet, perhaps one day it could. And so there were many political threats, many economic threats, many other threats. Indeed, during and after the French and Indian War, a growing number of colonists had felt the British simply looked down upon them, did not appreciate them, and saw a growing divide between the two countries, to the extent they had to be two countries. But ultimately, Congress would declare independence, and the Declaration of Independence enlist very clearly why they had been forced to this difficult, drastic decision. And many of them were lawyers, others were businessmen, or as plantation owners, essentially commercial farmers, all accustomed to legal language, and to proving why something had to be done, with evidence. And Declaration of Independence, again, sets that out, and for the benefit of the entire world, in part because the colonies did hope to get the support of other countries. France, most importantly, would also get support from Spain, from the Netherlands, from other countries. Indeed, the very first country who would recognize America as an independent state would not be any European country, but would be Morocco in North Africa. And during World War II, when the United States went to fight the Nazis, the first place we did so was not in Normandy, or in Italy, or in Germany itself, but rather Operation Torch, liberating Morocco from German occupation. And so the Declaration of Independence would be voted for in Congress on July 2nd, 1776. John Adams, who was often the case, was very right and very wrong, said July 2nd would be remembered forever with great celebrations for what it meant for American independence. Over the course of the next few months, the various members of the Congress set their signatures to the Declaration, beginning, of course, with the man who first put his John Hancock on it, John Hancock, who, according to legend, signed his name so big that Fat George in London could read it without his spectacles. There were some delegates who refused to sign, particularly some from Pennsylvania, who, representing a colony, or now a state, with many Quakers opposed to fighting, felt they could not in good conscience support a declaration which would surely lead to war. But 12 colonies voted for it, New York abstained, and America declared independence from Great Britain.